5 rules to fix Overwatch 2? It's 18 minutes long? Wait, that's me. That's either a great thing or a bad thing. Oh god. Oh Jesus.
Overwatch 2's balance is muddled and increasingly unproductive.
Wait, what?
So what do I mean by that?
Holy Jesus.
Well, the focus of this video is to spark a conversation. I'm looking to augment the balance philosophy we as players use to discuss Overwatch. The player base of Overwatch is vast, variable, and volatile, ranging from middle-aged fathers to teenage esports prodigies strapped to gaming toilets.
I already like the direction that this is going.
As such, to facilitate a productive dialogue, I want to present a framework for how we as players approach crafting balanced concepts and suggestions.
Sure.
In essence, we all play video games to have fun, but where that fun comes from varies. The perspective of every player deserves to be heard. My goal is to supply the tools of constructive criticism.
I don't want to say no, because like the right answer is to say yes. Everyone's perspective matters. There's a lot of people in this world that don't have something to say. They just want to say something. The key is not to weigh them all the same. For example, a lot of people talk about top-down balance philosophy, which I agree with to an extent, right? Like there needs to be the idea that people at the highest level, that is the top that a character can be played, don't have things break. But at the low end, that doesn't mean like people should, like, there was a problem in GOATs, right? Where people weren't dying. Like, characters literally couldn't die. And then, like, gold players would have 3.5-minute fights where they just stand there and nobody dies. That's bad. Like, you can't be ruining the experience for people that are not good at the game. Like, even the bronze players deserve balance for them, right? Like, you can't have characters that are so OP or so, like, easy/hard to play that they literally don't work in certain ranks, right? Like, you can't have one character that just dominates the whole rank, right? A good example, Old Bastion, right? Old Bastion was kind of like that. So eventually everyone kind of decided that Bastion was, like, really bad for the game and kind of sent him off to the farm, which is why all the bronze players hated Bastion, but they could still play with or against Bastion. But anything above, like, Plat, like, you never played him. It was like a cheese strap, pirate ship. It was a very, 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 very niche, like, you pull it out last second, but, like, in top 500 GM, like, let's say you lost a fight versus the Bastion, you instantly swap to the counters. Like, you pulled out the Diva, you pulled out the Ryan/Winston, you pulled out the Tracer, pulled out the... and just you rushed his ass, right? Like, you were going for one fight. So, I like the way they're framing this, but at the same time, I'm a little... yeah.
Criticism, not to speak for everybody. This video has 2 parts. First, I'll present 5 rules to guide the balance debate. In the second part, I'll provide examples of my rules in action. Together, we'll dive deeper into the philosophy of Overwatch balance. But before we begin, I want to put forth some questions for you to ponder throughout the video. What is fun in the context of Overwatch? How do we craft concepts that solve issues for the long term? And can we balance this game to be both fun and competitively?
Okay, I'm going to answer these. Number 1, what is fun in the context of Overwatch? Fun is what you make of it, which sounds like a cop-out answer, but hear me out on this. I think things like playing with friends, I think coordination, I think interactions, I think impact are the things that make fun. Coordination with other characters, Nano Blade, old tank stuff, you want to talk like Ryan Zarya, Winston Diva. Impact, meaning that when you shoot things and hit things, they die. Or, if you hit your correct cooldowns in a cycle, things die. Or if you hit your ultimates, things die. There was an example, let's say you had a big grav, right, in Overwatch 1, big grav. If they beat the grav or tranked the grav, you went, well, they had a counter ult. It's okay, they had a counter ult. In Overwatch 2, though, or towards the end of Overwatch 1, they had a cooldown. They had massive healing. They didn't have an ultimate. They didn't have something that was designed to beat you or to save them. They had a cooldown. They had some random, like, big burst healing. Like, they had these other things that saved them that were outside of what you would consider ult v ult, right? Like, big grab, everyone should die, right? Like, you hit a big grab, tons of damage, everyone's stuck, but they throw a cooldown to the side, you know, that pops his shift, everyone gets a bunch of healing while shooting the ground at the same time. and then like Ana nades the ground or Kiri Suzu's, and then everyone's invulnerable for a half a second so they don't take the burst damage, but then they also get healed a ton. Grav Dragon was a big meta. Like, Grav Dragon was so powerful because Mercy could damage boost the Grav or the Dragon that they nerfed it so that Mercy's damage boost no longer affects dragons, because it was so powerful that when you grabbed them and you dragon them, they died no matter what, every time. But then Grav Dragon nowadays literally doesn't get a kill. It doesn't even work. It legitimately doesn't work. When I think of Overwatch, I think of the people I can play with, my friends, fun, impact on the game, as well as whatever character I'm playing. Like, swinging on someone on Ryan feels good. Hitting a big shatter feels good. Hitting a big fire strike feels good. You know? But if they never die, those things don't matter. Number 2, how do we craft concepts that solve the issues long term? That's a tough one. That's a really, really, really deep one. And unfortunately, Overwatch kind of will always struggle with that. When certain mechanics get added, like anti-heal or invulnerability onto cooldowns, right? It's tough to balance them. And vulnerability is one of the hardest things to balance, and it started with BAP Lamp. So people talk about Transcendence, right? Transcendence doesn't make you invulnerable. It just gives you crazy amounts of healing. But you can still die through Transcendence. You cannot die through a BAP Lamp. Think about that. Transcendence, which was always considered, at least for the first 13 years of Overwatch, not 13 years of Overwatch, sorry, 13 seasons of Overwatch, was considered the anti-ult ultimate, is sufficiently much worse than a cooldown. Feels like 13 years. I know. I say 13 years because, like, I don't remember what season BAP came out, but it was like somewhere in, like, mid-goats. Like, season 13 sounds right. Maybe 14. So yeah, the cooldown's more powerful than the ult. Suzu's the same thing, right? Those types of concepts destroy what would be Beat or Transcendence. There's no need to have a defensive ult. You used to actually pick team comps like, we need to get a Zen here. We need to get a Lucio here. Because if it was overtime, right? Like, oh, they have 2 minutes to attack. We need a Zen. We need a Lucio. Why do we need a Zen? Why do we need a Lucio? Because they're going to build up ults. We need to build up an ult that stops their ults. Good to go. Nowadays, you don't even think about that. You just pick BAP. You pick Kiri, right? And it's like, just time your Suzu. Just time your lamp, right? Think about those. Those are things that have changed the entire concept of how Overwatch works. How do you fix those? Can't. There's no way to balance immortality. It literally is impossible. Not saying remove them, because it's a different game nowadays. I'm just saying, if we're talking crafting concepts, I don't think it's possible. Third, can we balance this game to be both fun and competitively viable? I'd argue yes. Doable. There is never a state where the game will be truly balanced. Never will. It doesn't exist. Even if you did every update that every pro player wanted to make, the game wouldn't be balanced. It's not possible. Why? Because even if you get close to having perfect balance, new hero comes out, breaks it. It will never, ever, 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 ever be possible. I would rather have things that shake up the meta and make it so that we play new stuff, so we don't all play dive for 6 months. We don't all play rush for 6 months. We don't all play poke for 6 months. Like, every month, if you just shake that bitch up, aggressive balance, just keep doing it. Yeah, stuff might break every once in a while, but at least it's keeping it fresh, right? So I think that's much more doable than perfect competitive balance or perfect fun balance. So we'll see. Which, by the way, if you do that, that kind of makes it more fun. The only thing I would say is certain characters that I like thought of like cheese heroes, like Mei, Bastion, Sim, Torb. Those characters being super strong are much less fun to players because they don't feel skillful. So we were just watching that video before about League of Legends and how they were talking about like how they balance characters sometimes based off popularity, and how like if a character was super fun and people love to play him, they kept that character strong. I'm not saying Overwatch should do that, but it's interesting to think about. Okay, that was way longer than I expected. But let's watch for a little bit. Let's let them cook. Wait, did their friends make the music?
To start off, I think it's important that you all know where I'm coming from and my experience with Overwatch. I've been playing off and on at varying levels of interest since OW1 launched in 2016. I took an extended break shortly after Ashe launched, returning briefly when BAP and Sigma dropped. Since then, I didn't play the game until OW2 launched late last year.
No, you missed Double Shield. I wish I did that.
As primarily a tank player. This was before the advent of
tank player, Pog.
Currently, though, I primarily play quick play. I peaked at GM3
Based.
as support, with my tank and
Based.
DPS role sitting at mid-diamond. If I were to just say, make the game fun and call it a day, that wouldn't be very helpful now, would it? Instead,
True.
I'm going to boil down my definitions of fun Overwatch into these 5 fundamental rules. Each of these is essential to inform balanced concepts and criticisms conducive to improving the game. 1. Each role must be defined and consistent. What is it that tanks do? Why should I be excited to pick tank over other roles?
Yeah.
Are they resigned to be ability and damage sponges? Perhaps you think it's their job to take and deny space. Or should they be an imposing presence in a teamfight that you must work around rather than tunnel through? Not all these concepts are mutually exclusive. We'll come back to these definitions later. 2. Consider every player in a given match. How does a tank interact with the other 9 players? Or on a more macro scale, by allowing all 3 roles to have some form of soft or hard CC, you enable situations where one player can be chain stunned for more than 10 seconds. Sure, the abilities are fun for the side using them, but it's certainly not for the receiving party. At this point, we're just begging to return to Overwatch 1. 3. Balance cannot be strictly numerical. Of course, number changes are the easiest in terms of concept, developer hours, and immediacy. However, they can only alleviate so much tension in the long term. Often, making these types of changes incrementally exaggerates specific issues, such as the immense damage and healing creep streamers like Flats have talked about.
I do think the numbers have gotten insane, but I don't think it's just support fault. I don't think it's support fault alone. I think it's just in general. I think that damage numbers for tanks, damage numbers for DPS.
It's not the same shit! That's light blue! This is dark blue! That's light blue! This is dark blue! Not the same shit!
And damage numbers for supports and healing numbers have all gotten too high for what the health pools are.
Though, crucially, I want to stress the strictly part of this point. Changing numbers is not inherently bad, and often can be a good thing. Take Bastion as an example. The recent change to his weapon spread is a number change, but does not affect his most irritating matchup, shredding tanks. Now, if this change were alternatively a nerf to his per pellet damage, perhaps even tightening the spread of his weapon slightly, we maintain or perhaps strengthen his effectiveness against squishies at short to mid ranges, all while attenuating his threat against tanks. Obviously, many may argue Bastion needs a full-scale rework, which I don't disagree with, but this demonstrates the value of appropriate number changes for short-term adjustments. 4th, control and counterplay are essential. The feeling of being in control of your character, like you lost a fight to the player and not the game, is critical for any shooter.
Yeah.
We should strive for nearly every death to feel like, man, if only I saved my ult, or if I landed my ability, I would have won.
This is kind of what I meant about the whole, like, if May or Bastion or Sorb or Torb or Sim become strong, people don't feel like they actually lost to somebody, they feel like they got cheesed.
In the same vein, long cooldowns are antithetical to being in control of your hero. Abilities like Lamp and Life Grip, which are only seen about once per fight, feel terrible on both sides. Leaning into these impactful but infrequent abilities creates clunky kits, which ultimately feel inconsistent. As Spyro recently argued on an episode of the Group Up podcast.
The point needs to be shorter cooldowns, more choices, more counterplay. And you can't fix that by changing the cooldown. You decrease the frequency of that instance, but it still feels terrible. If they increased Hog Hook duration to 10 seconds, right, the cooldown, it would still feel terrible for somebody to get hooked. If they increased Suzu to 25 seconds, it still would feel terrible. So for me, it should be slightly less impactful abilities that are not game-changing, that have counterplay, and that allow more frequent decisions. And then they need to try to introduce, through character design as well as ability design, abilities that always have counterplay.
So what Spill is saying, though, is true. I don't see it happening. So this is what we were talking about before, about the whole Transcendence versus Beat versus Lamp versus Suzu. This would literally require, like, multiple characters to have their abilities completely reworked. Overwatch just ain't gonna do that. Overwatch, when they design new abilities, think about cool factor. Like, they think about, like, something that's not, like, gonna be fun. Thing is cool. Like, something impactful, right? But then figure out the balance part later.
You need to stop making characters like Roadhog or Malga, who you have zero way of playing around CDs and spam. They have nothing. Or we need to change the way that those abilities, that those tanks struggle with the most.
The most complained about abilities in Overwatch, more often than not, have fundamental flaws in their design. Decreasing the theoretical frequency of these abilities is detrimental to both the controlling player and the opposition. The abilities will still be used in the same way as before. Instead, increasing the cooldown only acts to the detriment of lower ranked players who lack the judgment to perfect their ability usage. 5th, not everything needs a rework. This point was best articulated by Daniel Fenner on that same episode of the Group Up podcast.
I just think that it's okay to have heroes that not everybody loves. As a support player, this comes up with Moira a lot. Like, a lot of people want to...
Happy to be back.
Well, thanks so much. I appreciate it. Yeah, I think I'm gonna agree with this too. If I know where he's going with this,
heroes that
I think I've legitimately said this.
not everybody loves. As a support player, this comes up with Moira a lot. Like a lot of people
Yeah.
want to see Moira changed. It's like she's got no utility. She doesn't help.
I said that. Remember, I did say this back in the beta. Remember back in the beta when they added the enfeeble orb, and I was like, stop, just stop. Like, it's okay to have characters be like kind of 2-dimensional starter characters. Like Moira is a high healing mobility character. That's what she is. That's it. Period. Back in the beta, they were trying to figure out what to do with Moira. Beta 2. They added something called the Enfeeble Orb, which changed Moira's damage orb from the damage orb that you know now to a very fast traveling projectile that if you hit someone with would turn down their damage by 75% for like 3 or 4 seconds. So if you got hit by it, you would be doing 75% less damage or 25% of your current damage to enemies. So you basically were a wet pool noodle. You were a wet pool noodle for 4 seconds. And the problem with it is it was a reactive ability. So you'd sit there on Moira and wait for somebody to do something, like a Ryan would pin in or Genji go for blade, and then you'd throw the orb at him. So it went from being a proactive, like you're just orbing as often as you can, heal orb, healing orb, damage orb, like going in for plays, you would just sit there and be like charged up, ready to go. Like you're like, oh, here we go. Here it comes. Poof. You know, it was so stupid. And I remember being very much like, this is the worst ability you guys have ever added. Please stop. And then people were against me with it. I remember there was actually a few streamers that were like, no, it's a good change. I was like, no.
As a support player, this comes up with Moira a lot. Like a lot of people want to see
I'm
Moira
glad they went
changed.
back.
It's like she's got no utility. She doesn't help the team. You don't see her in pro play. I see that as okay. There's people who play Moira, they like Moira, and they do well on Moira. Like Moira does well on ladder, and that's fine. I think it's okay that Moira is not going to see time in the Overwatch League if there are people who like playing Moira.
And she
they
did get
should
played
be
in
careful
Overwatch League.
with reworks because like people like heroes, and if they get reworked, then they might not like that hero.
Pending what Daniel said, I think when we consider reworking a hero, we should also ask, how can we diversify ability interactions without changing the fundamental feel of this hero? Not necessarily making the hero viable in the meta, but
That last
increasing the
part's a little bit,
scenarios in which they can be
but
used. So with those
disappointing.
rules laid out, I have a few specific examples that I'd like to go over. Starting off with rule 1, I'm going to create a broad definition of each role. Beginning with something easy and foundational,
Good music.
the DPS role. I think this role is best described as pressure creators, and by extension, space creators. Now you may be thinking, isn't that the tank's job? Well, yes and no. Let me explain. DPS create pressure through various means, whether it be the off angles a tracer takes, altering the
True.
map geometry like Mei's wall, accelerating access to a position
That's
like
so
Finn's TP,
true,
or through the threat
actually.
of their raw damage potential like Genji. These all effectively create space by forcing enemies out of position.
One of the most important things, if you've never been taught this before, is space is only created if there's a threat to occupy that space. For example, Dorado first choke. If your Ryan walks all the way to the fountain, technically they've cleared all the space between the fountain and the choke. But if there's a Widow on the choke high ground at the end of first, that space is unusable. If they have a Junkrat hiding in the mini room, most of that space is unusable. If you have a Winston that's sitting on the stairs, guarding the stairs, that whole space is unusable. Unless people are threatened out, that space doesn't actually exist. What pressures that space out? Tanks if they can reach, or DPS. So for example, the Widow is the space creator for the defensive side because they own everything up through the choke. Yeah, they don't own the fountain, but everything behind the fountain, they own it.
How do tanks differ? I would define tanks as the deniers. Not just space deniers, though most do just that. Each tank denies a specific aspect of the enemy team's advantage. Some tanks like Orisa deny space by being an unkillable wall. Shared between Orisa, D.Va, and Sigma is the ability to deny utility through absorbing projectiles. Tanks like Ball and Doomfist deny both space and angles by literally pushing enemies out of position. Sigma baits utility through long-range damage pressure. He also, along with Ryan and Winston, denies utility, ult charge, and poke damage through intelligent shield usage. You'll note this category is very broad, but you'll also note that it does not require
It is broad,
tanks
yeah.
to absorb
I was gonna
utility
say, I don't
by
know if
taking
I'd
the
throw
full brunt
Winston,
of it.
Ryan, and
Most meta tanks have
Sigma in the
presence
same
primarily
category.
through the threat of their lethality.
I understand what
coupled with
he's saying,
abilities
though.
that allow them to mitigate the utility that is used against them. Alright, Now we'll tackle probably the most challenging role to define. Support is extremely diverse. Commonly, they all heal, but that doesn't encapsulate all they have to do in a game. Ultimately, I think the term support is the most accurate descriptor of this role. They prop up their teammates through healing, utility, or damage pressure. Good support players help their team maintain and create space by sustaining them through the enemy's pressure. Support players often create the openings which allow their team to capitalize on a kill, whether that be through anti-nade, Kiriko or Yari headshots landing a pick, or Lucio speed boosting your team in for an aggressive play. But they can also stabilize a team fight. Take a Lucio speed boosting your team out of danger, or ultimates like Zen's Trans and Mercy's Valk. I think support is by far the most versatile role, at least in Overwatch 2. Probably why it's the most played, but what they all have in common is the ability to press and stabilize their team's advantage.
So can kind of do almost everything except this make space.
With all that said, how do we actually use this when discussing balance? To elucidate on that, I'm going to present some of my concepts and criticisms about the game, and I'll explain how they are informed by my 5 rules. Hopefully, my concepts can serve as examples or starting points for your own ideas, which I'd love for you to share in the comments. Starting us off with Rule 3, I have this concept for a rework of anti-healing effects. Now, this comes packaged with a whole lot of other reworks and changes for other heroes.
Anti is... Okay, well, first off, Ana is one of the most beloved heroes in Overwatch and is actually the most played character in all of Overwatch, if you didn't know. Fun fact. Second off, because it's such one of the most powerful and most beloved characters, it's a little tricky to talk about, you know? It's a little tricky because people love the character. They don't want their shit changed. And, like, I completely understand that. But Overwatch 2 is a new game. And I'm not saying I'm picking a side. I didn't say that. I'm not picking a side. I am being very objective with this and saying, look, there has been many times so far in the last year where we've had to balance things because Ana-Nade exists. We've had to change the balance of many heroes, specifically tanks, because Ana exists. Everyone will jump and immediately say, what about Kiri? But then that you literally are starting a very dangerous conversation of if they pick a character, your teammate needs to pick another, because like it's not the Ana affecting the supports. It's not the tank counter swap game, right? So like if they go Orisa because I'm on Roadhog, then I can go Zarya because they're on Orisa, and then they can go Sigma or Winston because I'm on Zarya. No. Their go Ana stops me from playing my game on tank. I then rely on my other support to then swap to counter their support. But my support's not getting countered. It's me. So instead of the tanks playing the counter swap game, you added a third variable, which is the Ana. And so the Ana is the person who's shutting you down. So now you need the Kiri too. It's much easier when the person across from you, your counter, you can make a swap to. When it then becomes someone on the enemy team that's countering you is now relying on a teammate to help and save you, especially in a game like Overwatch, you could argue, right? That's how Overwatch is. And I don't necessarily disagree, but this is also why we have role queue nowadays, because in Overwatch 1, there was this notion that picking 5 DPS and 1 tank was not a good idea, or 1 support, and that you needed supports. You needed a Mercy, you needed a Zen, right? Nobody wanted to play Mercy, right? So you'd load into games and you'd have the standoff where everyone sit there 6 DPS looking at each other like, who's going to go Mercy? Who's going to swap? Who's going to swap? And everybody on the team knew that someone should swap, but they wouldn't. And so sometimes you'd have games...
If you tap now to watch a short video, you'll receive 30 minutes of ad-free music.
Basically, what would happen is you'd have... Wow, the timing on that is insane. What would happen is you'd have 6 people just pick DPS and just sit there and lose. So by that notion, the game was like, okay, 1, we can't balance for goats. 2, we have times where people don't want to pick support or don't want to pick tank, right? So you just have a team full of supports or a team full of DPS or DPS and support, no tanks, right? So because of that, the game was like, okay, we need to make sure that people are picking a little bit of each role. And the way that the game was formulated was 2-2-2. Like the standard way of playing the game, and this was based off of the old dive meta, was 2-2-2, right? Like before goats, we had dive. Everyone loved dives. So like 2-2-2 seems like the standard way to play the game, right? So here we are now, where a couple years in the future, we have role queue now. That solved the problem of people not picking support or picking tank in games. Now you don't have to worry about that when you load in. And there are people that definitely think role queue was not the best thing for the game, but I would argue that most people probably think role queue was the correct choice, right? Do they like that role queue was implemented? Maybe not. Can we all look objectively and say, hey, it solved a lot of the problems? I'd argue yes. So now that we have that kind of squared away, the same problem happens with Ana. You are now required your teammate to stop playing something that they enjoyed to save you, to let you still play the game. There's no guarantee that's one, going to happen. Two, they'd have to play it well. Like, they have to understand you get antied, Suzu. They don't get pressured early. You know, they don't, now all of a sudden they're a little bit vengeful to you because, like, oh, I don't want to play this character. I wanted to play something else. You know, like, they're going to start judging you a little bit more because they're like, oh my God, this tank player made me swap. All right, we'll see how good you are. I'll give you what you want. Now you better pop off, right? Like, that's how people act, right? I'm not saying nerf Ana. I'm not saying, you know, rework anti-nade. I'm not saying anything definitively. What I'm saying, at least in the past of Overwatch, whenever there's been a big problem that multiple characters have to be balanced around because some interaction exists, to not literally become either A, unplayable, or B, break whatever characters are involved, it's typically a bad sign. And Overwatch 2 is a different game. We don't have as many shields. We don't have as many abilities in the way. You get a lot of value out of it. So, I don't know. It's not an easy question to answer, and I'm not taking a side. I'm just laying out perspective. All right, let's continue.
Following my second rule. But starting with Ana, her anti-nade would function as a healing absorb rather than a full stop to healing for its entire duration. Where the actual balanced numbers lie will take some testing, obviously, but let's say 200 for now. This could be displayed in-game with a purple outline on the health bar as it is now, but instead it fills up as you heal through the absorb, after which point the absorb would disappear and any remaining healing would apply normally. To counteract this huge nerf to the ability, the cooldown would be reduced.
So basically, if you get antied, your supports could pump you with healing until it breaks the anti, and then you would start getting healed? Okay.
Quite substantially. Perhaps some 3 to 5 seconds. So how does this change adhere to my 5 rules? Rule 1, anti-nade.
The problem with this is I don't think it would feel very responsive or intuitive to both the player who's healing and the person who's antied. I think it would feel very awkward.
No longer acts as a hard counter to Zen's ultimate. Though this matchup wasn't the worst because of the skill involved in baiting the CD, the decreased cooldown on nade should compensate for the lost potential aggression with a renewed capacity to stabilize your own team through Transcendence's duration, thus fitting our definition.
You gotta remember, a lot of people already don't understand when they're anti. Yeah, the TikTok, you are purple, the purple TikTok. Overwatch does a really good job trying to make things intuitive to you, except Briggs, Inspire. Jesus Christ, it's been 5 years at a circle. Anyways, other than that though, typically you understand like the radius of things. Like for example, the Sombra rework, right? Like now you can see like the radius of someone will be able to detect you. They do a good job with some of these things, most of these things. I think this would be a little bit difficult.
Of support. Rule 2. Another matchup we've diversified with this change is against abilities like Hog's Take a Breather. Whereas before, anti-nade completely shut down Hog's sustain. Now the Hog has a choice. Does he use some of his healing to push through the absorb? Or
you were already doing that though, so...
He's not resigned to death or hiding behind a corner now. The Hog has options without eviscerating the impact the Ana has.
I don't know if I like the idea of zero until...
With this rework, we fundamentally changed how anti-healing effects interact with players for the long-term benefit.
It's an idea. I'm not going to shit on their idea, but
further
I
options
don't totally
for number
agree.
Tweaks beyond duration, as we can also adjust the absorb amount to either strengthen or weaken the ability as necessary. Rule 4. The impact of anti-nade is lessened, but in exchange, we've made a more frequent and engaging ability. Beyond just the Ana, the opposing team is now presented with more diverse counterplay opportunities for this ability. Should they retreat to heal off the absorb, or should the BAP use regen burst to stabilize his team? Rule 5. With this change, we have given Moira's healing orb added utility and being a great method to clear the absorb from multiple teammates, all without changing Moira herself. Also, Ana's grenade stays largely the same gameplay-wise. Barring the more frequent usage, Ana players should find this change just as engaging as before. Another rework I'd make to support this change to anti-healing effects is to Kiriko's Protection Suzu. This should also mend much of the frustration with the ability. I'd remove the cleanse effect, shorten the invulnerability, potentially remove the intangibility.
I'm already not a fan. Invulnerability is the big problem. Invulnerability is unbalanceable. We learned that in Overwatch 1. I understand what they're trying to cook up here, but At that point, if you're just like the whole cleanse idea is genuinely much better than invulnerability.
Allow it to burst heal for 70 or more baseline. Also to compensate.
Also, this must have came out before the patch notes, because now it does what, 110 or some shit, or 120 or whatever when you're cleansing something, like an ability. So it actually goes even higher than that. When it cleanses a debuff, yeah.
Compensate for this considerable nerf, I'd reduce the cooldown by some 2 to 5 seconds. If we were to remove the intangibility effect, I would append that with immunity to stuns or knockbacks for the duration. The idea being that Doomfist would be stopped as if punching a fortified Orisa instead of slipping right through them. Alright, so how have my 5 rules informed me?
I like the last one though, is like you can interact with them but they don't get CC'd. I think that's better than flying straight through them on Doomfist or like Ryan or pinning. I'll give you that.
Rule 1. Using our definition of support, Kiriko can sustain her team through moments of lethal burst damage with a well-timed Suzu. Rule 2.
If you think Suzu's fine, go back to like when I was watching the beginning of this and I talked about the immortality field problem, or the immortality problem versus Overwatch 1's problem or way of dealing with ultimates being like beat and transcendence, because I don't want to give the whole 8-minute rant again, and that'll probably give you a much better idea, because it's not the idea that Suzu's unbalanced, it's the fact that power creep of Suzu and immortality field existing is the problem. Like, immortality in general is unbalanceable, period. Even if it doesn't feel that impactful in game, you can go back, but you'll figure out that that's not the way Overwatch used to be. It was like ult versus ult. Now we don't have that anymore. It's cooldown versus ult.
2. If we reduce the cooldown of Suzu significantly, I think increasing Swift Step's cooldown by 1 to 2 seconds would help in giving her moments of vulnerability. Her wall climb passive is already a strong evasion tool, and Swift Step is a fun but often annoying ability when on the opposing end. Rule 3. The removal of cleanse with the addition of a consistent heal diminishes its effectiveness against anti-nade while remaining a strong counterplay when your whole team is hit. Furthermore, Suzu no longer hard counters ultimates like Shatter and Rampage. The latter we'll get into in a moment. Rule 4. The reduced cooldown of Suzu along with the removal of cleanse produces skill expression through fast reaction times. It is still possible to stop an Earth Shatter with some really good timing or an apt prediction. No cleanse and shorter invulnerability reduce her impact when teleporting into a 1v1. Increasing the Swift Step CD would also expand the window of opportunity to
It feels silly that I have to sit there and wait for Kiriko to use her 15-second cooldown so I can use my ult that takes 3 times longer to build. That was basically the whole thing I was talking about earlier. It's like, I don't hate Kiriko, I don't hate Bap Lamp, it's just the immortality aspect. Like, basically what I was saying before is like, even Transcendence, like, before if you got like a big grab, they have Trank, you were like, they had Trank. You could still cut through Transcendence. Like, it does healing, it doesn't do immortality, right? So like, in Overwatch 1, we would pick Lucio or Zen if there was like a 2-minute overtime. It's like, we need a defensive ult. I've never heard someone say in Overwatch 2, we need a defensive ult. You just have Kira, you have Bap, you have a defensive ult on a cooldown, you know? So, that was like basically my whole rant before.
Finally, Rule 5. We keep the most fun aspects of Suzu, like timing it to survive a Diva Bomb, negating a Doomfist punch.
Anti-heal counters trans too? Yeah, you're not wrong, actually. You're not wrong.
Or avoiding being burned by Ash's dynamite. All of these are
2-1.
still possible with some pinpoint reactions or predictive timing. Finally, let's talk about Queen's ultimate given this healing absorb concept. Very simply, I'd have her apply the same effect as our reworked anti-nade, except this would have a slightly larger absorb. Of course, adhering to Rule 2, we must consider how our reworked Suzu would interact with this ult.
I actually don't mind having anti-healing on an ultimate. I actually don't mind it. I think that as an ultimate ability, that's okay. It's not a cooldown. You know, you spend 3 minutes building it. I actually have zero problem with Junker Queen having anti as an ult.
Seeing as the only impact Suzu would have in this matchup is the burst heal or a potential to deny the ultimate with good timing, perhaps an absorb of 300 would be manageable. Of course, subject
It's impossible to get value out of his ult nowadays. For what, Junker Queen? You're like you're like a Junker Queen expert, so I'm not surprised. Yeah, you get like you have to wait out Suzu 90% of the time, and then people are spread. You don't actually end up getting a whole lot of follow up. You might get like what, like 1-2 kills if you're lucky, probably most of the time. A few games last night, I swapped with ult. Really? On Junker Queen? I low-key think Junker Queen's actually pretty decent this season. So that's kind of sad. I mean, obviously, you're probably playing the counter swap game, but that kind of makes me sad.
Testing. Bring back experimental mode. All right, now how does this conform to rules 1, 3, 4, and 5? Well, rule 1, as it did before, Rampage still denies healing to the impacted targets, thus fitting our definition of tanks being deniers. 3, as this change is largely identical to Ana's, I think the same point applies here. 4, supports other than Kiriko have gained a dynamic
it's fine
in
having
this matchup,
anti-heal
as they all
result.
have the ability to heal through the absorb. I think Lucio would be the most
doing
interesting
against
because he
Maga?
gets the choice between
Maga's weird. You know, like he's probably gonna get nerfed before ranked, so I don't think he's gonna be like that insane. But Maga doesn't get as much healing versus Junker Queen, so he's a lot easier to kill as a team.
Healing
But like in the 1v1, I think he's kind
depending
of
on the
rolls.
situation. 5. Just like our Ana rework, Rampage's impact stays largely the same. Of course, we'll need to test and monitor the absorb amount to ensure the ult remains impactful without being uncounterable. So that was probably my most complex rework idea. Now, I'd like to take a step back and look at just one ability, specifically Baptiste Lamp. This suggestion is nothing new, but simply put, I changed Immortality Field to Damage Reduction Field. Now,
Yeah, I've heard that one a
the
bajillion
argument that
times.
This doesn't fit the name, but honestly,
It's like
everyone
the
calls
Warren
it Lamp
special.
anyway, ignoring the precise numbers of the damage reduction and lamp health.
Yeah, I feel like Healing Absorb is a really tough mechanic to communicate in a tactile and intuitive manner. That is exactly what I said when they talked about the Anonade one, which is why I was like, not a big fan.
For the sake of the video, let's focus on how this change fits my rules. First of all, the overall function of Lamp being a tool to save and stabilize your team is kept. Second, I want to consider how this affects the sniper matchup. Personally, I often use Lamp to peek Widows, and this is absolutely still possible. However, the Widow is now given a chance to kill me with a skillful set of headshots, or at least force me to back up. Because if I get hit, I know there is nothing preventing me from dying to a follow-up shot. Rule 3. We've removed the most frustrating component of Lamp, the immortality. It is now technically possible to kill a target in a Lamp, though it may be extremely difficult. This leads to rule 4. We divert.
Would you say Lamp is part of Baptiste's identity of like the hero fantasy of the character? See, when I think of Baptiste, I think of an aggressive DPS healing support. That's when I think of Bap. But you're right, though. And I saw someone say from a casual perspective, yes. You make a good point there. Is the immortality part also part of what you think of? Or let's say the drone did healing, like it was like a lifeline from Apex, right? Like let's just yoink that for a second, right? As long as it's still a drone that he throws out, is that still enough for you? Or do you think that the immortality is part of his hero fantasy? Or is it just the Lamp, the drone itself? What if the drone changed slightly? Like it was still a drone that he threw or activated, right? But instead of like the current Lamp you know of today, what if it was one that moved with him? Or, you know, like he has a thing that comes out of his backpack, the little thing. What if it was attached to that? Or, you know, like, so it sounds like as long as he has the Lamp, like the actual drone, in some form or fashion, that would still be the hero's fantasy, right? And accelerate healing by like 100%. Accelerated healing would be insane, actually. Would that actually be good though, or would it just be part of the problem? You know, I don't hate that actually. I don't hate it. But then the only problem with that is then now you're increasing healing, and then the need for having anti-healing becomes stronger because that would just be so strong. Maybe it did a little both. Maybe it reduced damage incoming by like 20-30%, but also increased healing by 30%. So if you were in an ult, let's say you're in grab and you throw the thing on the ground, you're taking 30% less damage, but you're also getting healing 30% more. That way it's a reactive and a proactive ability. Not saying like, I'm only using 30% just to have a low number. So basically a small window. It would be like an area of effect window, I guess. This is why I don't typically go too deep into like thinking about how I would change it, because it doesn't matter at the end of the day. I'm not a dev, and they typically don't like hearing feedback of, oh, you should do this. It's more of like, this doesn't feel good. That's typically what they do best with in terms of feedback. That's always what I've been told. But yeah, it's fun to think about sometimes.
Of Lamp on both sides. As the BAP, you no longer waste the Lamp if you place it early. There's utility in preventing bursts of damage or allowing your other support to reload. On the opposite side, you are now presented with a choice. Do you switch targets to the Lamp?
Yeah, I've heard this one many times.
Try to burn your target
damage
with the
reduction field instead of
perhaps you have a knockback to push them out of the Lamp's radius. Regardless, there is more control and more counterplay. I'd also argue this change adheres to Rule 5.
So 7 seasons of Will I Feel? Rework. Well, that's not totally true. Let's not pretend here, Community was screaming from betas through Season 2 that support felt like dog shit. I remember being one of the first people in Season 3 to start screaming, pull the brakes on buffing the supports. Holy shit, this is getting crazy. And everyone got mad at me for that. The whole support sentiment, support being strong sentiment, didn't start till 6 months ago at the max, I would say. It actually really started around like June, July, because I can point to it and tell you, because I wasn't doing content really talking about it. And I was like, I'm going to let everyone else figure it out. And then everyone else started talking about it, and then I jumped in on it.
Of his kit. The lamp still exists to prevent your teammates from dying. BAT players who enjoy him now will continue to do so.
By the way, the whole please point out problems, don't suggest solutions is not just a Blizzard/Team 4 thing. It's a general industry wisdom at the current moment, just to provide context on that front. Thank you, Cactus.
If anything,
that is,
this change could allow for
I didn't know if it was outside of that too.
Allowing for multiple
That's just what I've been told by
team fight.
Overwatch people, so good to know.
Those are just a handful of ideas informed by my 5 rules. But before I leave you, let's return to those questions I presented at the start of the video. So, what is fun in the context of Overwatch?
Yeah, I'll people joining us from Emong. What do you answer? How would you answer these questions?
Overwatch is a game with 39 unique heroes, and that roster is still growing. I think, universally, players have the most fun when they master any one or multiple of these kits in all kinds of scenarios. Hero swapping is a fun and integral part of the game, but should never be compulsory. Removing situations where you're forced to swap produces diversity for hero interactions and combos, and allows players to play the heroes that they identify with most. So, how can we craft concepts that solve issues long term? If we keep in mind the 5 rules I laid out in this video, we're forced to consider all the angles and complexities that balancing a game like Overwatch presents. We have the tools to not only craft our own ideas, but to help each other polish theirs. We are an increasingly diverse community of players from all backgrounds and skill levels. It is important that we can all have fun and enjoy this game we've invested so much of our time and love into. So remember to be kind to each other. Can we balance this game to be both fun and competitively viable? Probably one of the oldest questions in gaming in general, and this question is still hotly debated to this day. In my opinion, yes, we can. When we diversify counterplay opportunities, we create more instances of skill expression. Overwatch is at its best in terms of both fun and competitiveness when your skill as a player is displayed in your decision-making and mechanical skill. The most frustrating mechanics in Overwatch are often the least competitive. On the other hand, the most fun abilities are the ones which allow both that hero and anyone playing against them to make inspiring plays that turn the tide of a fight. Also, this type of balancing would improve Overwatch as an esport. After all, the most fun
Overwatch is an esport, oh god.
Play matches to watch are the ones where they pull off crazy combos and counterplays in novel ways. That is the version of Overwatch we should be vying for. So, what balance ideas do you have? How would your concepts fit the framework I presented? Maybe there's more I should have mentioned? Perhaps you disagree with some of my ideas. Let's start a conversation and learn from each other. Thanks for listening. I hope you all have a wonderful day.
That was pretty good. That was pretty good, actually. I didn't know what to expect out of that, but that was a pretty good one. Did a bit of cooking. Didn't agree with totally everything about like the rework side stuff, but overall not bad.